For 1,000 years, a road ran east. It began in the wet green fields of northern Europe, wound down through the vineyards of France, climbed the passes of the Alps, where snow lay late into spring, and went on through Italy, across the water, through the dry folded hills of Anatolia, until at last it came to a walled city standing on a ridge of pale limestone in the hills of Judea. Pilgrims walked that road. Some walked it barefoot as penance, carrying nothing but a staff, a leather satchel, and a letter from their bishop saying who they were and where they had come from. Many died on the way, of fever or thirst, or a knife in the dark, and were buried beside the track by strangers who did not know their names. Those who lived came at last to the gate of Jerusalem and knelt in the dust and wept. For most of those 1,000 years the road stayed open. The city changed hands. Romans held it, then Persians, then the armies of the new faith rising out of Arabia. And the pilgrims kept coming, paying their tolls, buying their bread, sleeping in hostels run by monks. It was not always safe. It was almost never comfortable, but it was possible. Then, in the last quarter of the 11th century, something shifted. New powers moved into the old lands. Roads that had been merely dangerous became impassable. And far away in the west, in a cold country of stone churches and quarrelling knights, a pope stood on a wooden platform in a field and said that God wanted something done about it. What followed lasted 200 years. It moved perhaps 1 million people across a continent. It built kingdoms out of nothing, on a strip of coast between mountain and sea. And it destroyed the greatest Christian city in the world. And it ended, at last, with a handful of exhausted men on a beach, watching the sails go out. It gave the world orders of warrior monks, castles that still stand, a vocabulary of grievance that has never entirely gone quiet, and stories that were being told and retold long after everyone who lived them was dust. This is the story of the Crusades, the long road east, and what waited at the end of it. Let yourself settle now. Loosen your shoulders. Let the light in the room grow dim, and if you feel like it, leave a note somewhere below saying where in the world you are listening from and what hour it is where you are. Then let the sound carry you. To understand why so many people left home, you have to understand what home was like. Europe, at the end of the 11th century, was a cold, wooded, and very local place. Most people lived their entire lives within a day's walk of where they were born. The world beyond that walk was rumour. A man in a village in Picardy might know the name of his lord and the name of his lord's lord, and after that the names dissolved into a fog of hearsay about kings and emperors who existed somewhere in the way that saints existed, real but unreachable. Roads were mud tracks that turned to soup in autumn. Bridges rotted and were not always replaced. The forest pressed close on every side, and in the forest there were wolves, and there were also men who had left the villages for reasons of their own. The land supported people, but only just. A bad harvest meant hunger by spring, and 2 bad harvests in a row meant that families walked out onto the roads carrying what they could. There had been famines in living memory that emptied whole districts. People remembered them the way people remember wars, and over this landscape of small fields and small lives lay a warrior class that had grown too numerous for the land beneath it. This is one of the quiet engines of everything that followed. In much of France and the German lands, inheritance had settled into a hard practice. The eldest son took the estate. The younger sons took a horse, a sword, some mail, and a blessing. There were, by the 11th century, a great many younger sons. They were trained from boyhood to ride and to fight, and to think of themselves as something better than the men who worked the soil, and they had nothing to be better with. so they took service. They rode for whoever would feed them. They built small castles on hills they did not really own and taxed the traffic that passed beneath. They fought each other, constantly, over grazing rights and mills and insults remembered from a generation before. The word for it was private war, and it was simply how the countryside worked. The church tried to contain it. Bishops proclaimed something called the peace of God, which put priests, pilgrims, peasants, women and church buildings outside the range of legitimate violence. Then came the truce of God, which forbade fighting on Sundays, then on Thursdays through Sundays, then during Lent and Advent, until, in theory, the fighting season had been squeezed into a narrow window of the year. Knights swore oaths on relics to observe it. Some of them even did. But the appetite was still there, and the young men were still there, and the church had spent a century trying to point that appetite somewhere useful without much success. The church itself was changing too. For generations, the papacy had been a local Roman office, bought and sold among the great families of the city, occasionally rescued by a German emperor who wanted a pope he could work with. Then came a movement of reform, born in monasteries like Cluny in Burgundy, which insisted that the church should be answerable only to God and to Rome, and not to any king or count who happened to hold the land the abbey stood on. The reformers won, slowly and bitterly. By the time our story begins, the papacy was a genuine power in Europe, willing to excommunicate an emperor and make him stand in the snow at Canossa waiting for absolution. That papacy had ambitions. One of them was reunion with the Christians of the East, because the Christian world was not one thing. It had split slowly over centuries, along a line running roughly down the middle of the Mediterranean. In the West, Latin was the language of worship. The Pope was the head of the church. Priests were expected to be celibate, and the bread of the sacrament was unleavened. In the East, the language was Greek. The emperor in Constantinople was the anointed protector of the faith. The patriarchs of the great cities governed by consensus. Priests married, and the bread was leavened. These were not, in themselves, world-ending differences, but they were carried by people who no longer travelled much between the two halves, who no longer spoke each other's languages, and who had begun to find each other faintly ridiculous. In the year 1054, legates from Rome laid a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and the patriarch excommunicated them back, and afterwards everyone went home and life continued. Nobody at the time thought it was the end of anything. Only later did it look like a wound that never closed. And Constantinople, in the 11th century, was still the greatest city in the Christian world, by an enormous margin. Rome was a shrunken town of ruins and marshes, where perhaps 30,000 people lived among the bones of 1,000,000. Paris was a settlement on an island in a river. London was mud and timber. Constantinople had perhaps 400,000 inhabitants. It had running water, public baths, street lighting on the main processional ways, hospitals, a university, and a bureaucracy that kept written records of everything. Its walls, 3 deep on the landward side with a moat in front of them, had never been broken by an enemy in 700 years. Travellers from the West, who saw it for the first time, wrote about it the way people write about miracles. They counted the churches and gave up. They described the palace of Blakeney, its walls faced in coloured marble, its ceilings gilded, and said plainly that no words they had were sufficient. That empire, the Roman Empire, as it still called itself, had been fighting for its life on and off for 400 years. And in the year 1071, it suffered a defeat that changed the shape of the world. Far to the east, in the highlands of Armenia near a town called Manzikert, the Emperor Romanos Diogenes met a Seljuk Turkish army under a sultan named Alp Arslan. The Seljuks were newcomers. They were Turkic nomads out of Central Asia, who had ridden west across Persia in the space of 2 generations, adopted Islam, taken Baghdad, and reduced the Abbasid Caliph to a figurehead blessing their conquests. They fought from horseback with composite bows, and their tactic was not to stand and receive a charge, but to melt away in front of it, shooting, and let the heavy enemy cavalry exhaust itself in the dust. At Manzikert, it worked perfectly. The Byzantine army was large but incoherent, stuffed with mercenaries of a dozen nations, undermined by a general who took half the force off the field at the crucial moment out of political malice. By evening, the Emperor of the Romans was a prisoner in a Turkish tent. Alp Arslan, by the account that has come down to us, treated him with courtesy, set a ransom, and let him go. It hardly mattered. Romanos returned to an empire that had already deposed him, was blinded by his rivals so clumsily that the wounds turned septic and died. The real damage was not the battle, it was what happened afterwards. The empire fell into 2 decades of civil war, and rival claimants to the throne hired Turkish warbands to fight for them, and paid them with land and let them settle. Anatolia, the great plateau that had been the recruiting ground and breadbasket of the empire for centuries, simply drained away. Greek farmers left, Turkish herders came in with their flocks. Within 20 years, a Seljuk sultan was ruling from Nicaea, a city 100 miles from Constantinople, a city where the creed of the Christian Church had been written. The empire had lost its heart and kept its head. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was itself no single thing that mattered more than anyone in the West understood. In Baghdad sat the Abbasid Caliph, spiritually revered, politically hollow, with the Seljuk Sultan holding real power at his shoulder. In Cairo sat a rival caliph of the Fatimid dynasty, Shia, where the Abbasids were Sunni, ruling Egypt, and, for much of this period, the coast of Palestine. The two hated each other with the specific bitterness of a family quarrel. In Syria, between them, lay a scatter of independent cities under Turkish emirs, who had inherited fragments of the Seljuk conquest, and now fought one another over wells and caravan routes. Aleppo against Damascus, Mosul against everyone, and Jerusalem, the city at the end of the road, passed back and forth between these hands. It was holy to all 3 faiths who claimed it. The Temple Mount, where the Jewish temple had stood until the Romans burned it, now carried the golden dome of the rock, built 4 centuries earlier over the stone from which Muhammad was said to have ascended by night. A short walk away stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, raised by Constantine's mother over the tomb, where Christ was believed to have been buried and to have risen. The city held perhaps 20,000 people in a space you could walk across in a quarter of an hour. Christian pilgrims had come there for centuries under Muslim rule, generally unmolested, sometimes taxed heavily, occasionally harassed. In 1009, a Fatimid caliph named Al-Hakim, a strange and increasingly unstable man, ordered the Holy Sepulchre demolished to its foundations. Even that had been repaired, decades later, by agreement with Constantinople. The system creaked but held. What broke it was the Turkish conquest of Syria and Palestine in the years after 1070. Not policy, but disorder. Authority fragmented. The roads filled with men accountable to nobody, and pilgrims began coming home with stories. Some of those stories were true. Some of them grew in the telling, as stories do when they are carried 1,000 miles by men who want to be listened to in a hall on a winter night. By the last decade of that century, in the churches of France and the Rhineland, people had a picture in their heads of the holy places defiled, and Christians beaten in the streets of the city where Christ had died. The picture was not accurate. It did not need to be. And in 1081, a new emperor took the throne in Constantinople. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and he was 33 years old, a soldier from a great military family, and by a considerable distance the most capable ruler the empire had produced in a century. He inherited a treasury that was empty, a currency that had been debased until nobody trusted it, a Turkish sultan a few days' ride from his capital, and a Norman adventurer named Robert Guiscard invading his western provinces from southern Italy. He survived it. He survived all of it by bribery, by marriage alliance, by hiring one enemy to fight another, by melting down church plate when he had to, and enduring the outrage that followed. He was a patient man with a very long memory, and by the middle of the same decade, with the Seljuk realm broken into quarrelling pieces after the death of its great sultan, Alexios saw an opportunity to take Anatolia back. He needed soldiers. Specifically, he needed heavy cavalry, the armoured Western knights who could break a Turkish line if they could ever be made to close with it. He had hired such men before, in small companies, and found them expensive, arrogant, and very effective. So in March of 1095, his ambassadors appeared at a church council at Piacenza in northern Italy, where Pope Urban II was presiding, and asked, politely and in general terms, for military assistance against the enemies of Christendom in the east. He was asking for a few thousand mercenaries. He had no idea what he had just started. Urban II was a Frenchman, born Odo of Châtillon into the minor nobility of Champagne, educated at Rennes, a monk at Cluny, then prior there, then cardinal, then pope. He was in his late 50s, tall, well-spoken, famously handsome in a grave way. And he had spent the first years of his pontificate unable to enter Rome, because a rival pope backed by the German emperor was sitting in it. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, that authority is a thing you have to be seen exercising. He spent the summer of 1095 travelling through France, his homeland, which no pope had visited in half a century. He consecrated altars, he settled disputes, he listened, and in November he convened a council at Clermont in the Auvergne, in the hill country of central France, where the bishops of the region gathered in a cathedral that was too small to hold them and spilled into the town. For 9 days the council did ordinary business. It confirmed the truce of God. It condemned the practices of buying church offices and of priests keeping wives. It excommunicated the King of France over an irregular marriage which took a certain nerve. Then, on the 27th of November, the Pope announced that he would preach in the open air. A wooden platform was built in a field outside the eastern gate, because no building could hold the crowd. It was late autumn in the mountains. The grass would have been white with frost in the morning, and wet by noon. People came in from the countryside and stood in the cold, breathing steam, waiting. We do not know exactly what Urban said. 5 men who claimed to have been present wrote versions of the sermon down. Years later, after everyone knew how the story ended, and no 2 of them agree, but across all the versions certain notes sound together, and it is probably safe to believe those. He spoke of the Eastern Christians, brothers in faith, suffering under an alien power. He spoke of Jerusalem, the navel of the world, the place where God had walked, held now by men who did not honour it. He spoke of the churches turned to other uses, and the pilgrims turned back at the gates. And then he turned to the men in front of him, the armed men, and told them the truth about themselves. You fight each other, he said. You burn your neighbour's fields and steal his cattle and call it honour. and you are damning yourselves for the sake of a mill and a meadow. Turn that iron outward. Go where the fight is righteous. Let those who have been robbers become soldiers of Christ. And then he offered something that had never quite been offered before in those terms. Anyone who went, not for gain but out of devotion, would have the penance owed for their sins remitted entire. The journey itself would count as satisfaction. A man who died on that road died absolved. To understand what that meant, you have to understand how these people thought about the afterlife. Sin was a debt. It was entered in a ledger you could not see and could not settle from your own resources, and every act of violence, every broken oath, every night with another man's wife went into the column against you. Penance was the slow, humiliating work of paying it down. A knight of 40 had accumulated an account he could not hope to clear by fasting on Fridays, and here was a pope saying that one journey, one hard and holy journey, would wipe the slate. The crowd began to shout. The chroniclers all record the shout, though they render it differently. Desfault. God wills it. God wills it. Adhemar, the Bishop of Le Puy, came forward at once and knelt, and asked permission to take the vow, which suggests very strongly that this had been arranged in advance. Others followed. Men tore strips of cloth and had them sewn as crosses onto the shoulders of their tunics, and that is where the word comes from, to take the cross. Crusade. Crusade, though nobody used that word for a long time afterwards. At the time they called it simply the journey, or the pilgrimage, or the way of God. Urban set a departure date, the Feast of the Assumption, in the following August, to give time for the harvest and for men to sell or mortgage what they had. He forbade priests to go without their bishop's leave, and husbands without their wives' consent, which tells you something about who was trying to go. He appointed Adhemar of Le Puy as his legate, the spiritual leader of the expedition, and then he went on travelling through France for another 8 months, preaching it again and again in Limoges, in Angers, in Tours, in Nimes, letting the news run ahead of him along the pilgrim roads and the trade routes and the monastic networks that connected every abbey in Europe to every other. He had wanted, most likely, an armed pilgrimage of the knightly class. Perhaps a few thousand men of substance, disciplined, led by a legate, going east to fight for the emperor and pray at the sepulchre and come home. What he got was a migration, because the message did not stay in the hands of the bishops. It escaped. It was picked up by wandering preachers, men outside the structures of the church, who took it into the villages and market squares of northern France and the Rhineland, and preached it in a hotter and simpler form. And the greatest of these, by far, was a small, filthy, barefoot man riding a donkey whose name was Peter the Hermit. Almost everything about Peter is uncertain, and some of it is certainly legend. He came from the region of Amiens. He was old, or looked old. He was very short. He wore a coarse wool robe and no shoes, and did not wash. And contemporaries record, with a kind of fascinated disgust, that his face was said to resemble the face of the donkey he rode. He ate almost nothing, a little fish, some wine, and when he spoke, people wept and gave him their possessions and followed him. Guibert of Nogent, who saw him, wrote that whatever Peter said or did was regarded as something close to divine, and that people pulled hairs from his donkey's tail to keep as relics. This is a useful detail. It tells you that the crowd who followed him were not thinking in the categories the Pope was thinking in. Peter preached a straightforward, incandescent message. Jerusalem was defiled. God had opened a road. Go now, not in August now, and so through the winter and early spring of 1096, in the villages of Picardy and Lorraine and the Rhineland, ordinary people began to sell everything. Chroniclers noted with astonishment that men were suddenly willing to accept absurd prices for good land, 7 vineyards for a horse, a farm for a suit of mail, because they were never coming back, and money was only weight to carry. Families put their household goods in carts. Old men who had never gone further than the next market town packed bread and set off. There were women, and there were children, and there were priests, and there were certainly a good number of men who had reasons for leaving that had nothing to do with God at all. They had no idea how far it was. Not the faintest conception. The chronicler Guibert records that whenever the column came in sight of a walled town, children would ask whether that was Jerusalem. By the spring, Peter had perhaps 20,000 people, moving with him along the Rhine and down the Danube, and other columns had formed behind other preachers. A knight called Walter Sansevoix led one ahead of him. A priest named Gottschalk led another, and a German count named Emicho of Floenheim led a third. And with Emicho the enterprise touched its first real horror. The reasoning, if you can call it that, ran like this. We are marching 2,000 miles to punish the enemies of Christ. There are enemies of Christ living in our own towns. Why go so far? The Jewish communities of the Rhineland were old, prosperous, and legally under the direct of the emperor and the local bishops. In the spring of 1096, that protection failed. At Speyer, the bishop acted quickly, sheltered most of the community in his own fortified house, and had some of the attackers punished, and perhaps a dozen people died. At Worms, the mob broke in. Some 800 were killed. At Mainz, the largest and richest community in the region, the archbishop took the Jews into his palace, and then when the crowd came over the walls, fled himself. More than 1,000 died there. Many, seeing what was coming, killed their own families, and then themselves, rather than accept forced baptism. And the Hebrew chronicles that record those days describe fathers blessing their children before doing it. And there is nothing to say about that, except that it happened, and that it was remembered for 900 years. Cologne, Trier, Metz, Regensburg, the pattern repeated. Some bishops fought for their people, and some hid, and some accepted conversions they knew to be worthless in order to save lives. None of this was sanctioned by the Pope. It had nothing to do with the plan made at Clermont. Emicho and his men never reached Jerusalem, never came close. Were broken up by the Hungarians when they tried to force a passage, and the survivors slunk home to a general assumption that God had judged them, a host of golden daffodils. But the massacres had happened, and a precedent had been set that would be followed in every subsequent expedition. And the Jewish communities of Europe would date their calendars by those months for centuries. Peter's own columns, meanwhile, were making their way down the Danube toward Constantinople, and behaving with mounting desperation. They had not brought enough food. They had never had enough food. 20,000 people moving through a countryside of subsistence farms strip it bare in a day. At Semlin on the Hungarian frontier, a dispute over a pair of shoes escalated into a riot in which thousands died. At Nis in Byzantine territory, some of the Germans set fire to mills after a quarrel, and the local governor sent out troops, and Peter lost perhaps a quarter of his people and all his baggage in an afternoon. The Emperor Alexios, who had asked for a few thousand professional soldiers, received a report that a horde of unarmed peasants, led by a barefoot preacher, was approaching his capital, having fought its way through 3 of his provinces. He handled it with the weary competence that characterized him. He met Peter courteously, gave the column food and money, listened to his account of the journey, and advised him with great firmness to camp outside the city, and wait for the real army, which was still assembling in France, and would not arrive for months. They did not wait, they could not. 20,000 people camped outside a city, with nothing to do, go bad quickly. They began stealing from the suburbs, stripping lead from the roofs of churches to sell. Alexios shipped them across the strait to a fort called Civitot on the Asian shore, which got them out of his city and, he must have known, into a great deal of danger. From Civitot they raided. Small parties went inland, burned villages, and came back with plunder, which encouraged larger parties. A German contingent seized a castle called Xerigorden and held it until the Turks cut the water supply, and, after 8 days of drinking the blood of their animals, the survivors surrendered and converted or died. Then a rumour reached the main camp that the Germans had taken Nicaea and were dividing the spoils and not sharing. That was enough. Against the advice of every experienced man present, and with Peter himself absent in Constantinople, trying to arrange supplies, the entire body marched inland on the 21st of October in a column 6 miles long, women and children following the fighters. The Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan was waiting 3 miles up the road in wooded ground. His archers opened at close range on a mass of people with no armour and no order. The front rank broke back into the ranks behind. Within an hour it was not a battle, but a hunt, running back down the road toward the camp, and in the camp the old men and the sick and the children were killed where they lay. A few thousand reached an abandoned fort on the shore and held out among the walls until Byzantine ships came for them. Of perhaps 20,000 who had crossed, some 3,000 survived. Peter the Hermit, who had been away, lived. He would go east again with the real army, and would be present at Jerusalem, and would die an abbot in Flanders many years later. The bones of the rest were still piled on that road a year afterwards, when the armed knights of the West came up it, and the chroniclers who saw them wrote that the heap was as high as a hill, and that the men riding past were very quiet. The men who came after were a different proposition entirely. There was no king among them. The 3 most powerful monarchs in the Latin West were all, at that moment, excommunicate or in conflict with Rome, and none of them went. What came instead were the great regional princes, each with his own following, his own treasury, and his own reasons, and there was no single commander over them. This absence of a head would nearly destroy the expedition a dozen times, and it is one of the more remarkable facts of the whole enterprise that it did not. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, was the richest, and the oldest, in his middle 50s, master of most of the south of France. Blind in one eye from a quarrel with a monastery over a toll, he had fought Muslims before, in Spain. He took the cross first among the great lords, and he sold nothing and mortgaged nothing, because he intended to stay in the East and rule there, and he brought his wife with him. He was proud, devout, difficult, and slow to forgive, and Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, travelled with him. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was in his late 30s. A tall, fair man, of enormous physical strength, about whom stories accumulated even in his lifetime, including one in which he cut a mounted Turk in half at the waist with a single stroke. He mortgaged his castle to the Bishop of Liege, and sold his county of Verdun to raise money. He came with his brothers, Eustace, and the much younger Baldwin, and Baldwin brought his wife and his ambition and no intention whatsoever of going home. Bohemond of Taranto was a Norman from southern Italy, the son of that same Robert Guiscard, who had spent years trying to tear the western provinces off the Byzantine Empire. He was about 40, exceptionally tall, fair-haired where his men were dark, and he had personally fought the Emperor Alexios in the field on 2 occasions and beaten him. He was intelligent, charming when it was useful, and entirely without illusions. He heard of the expedition while besieging a town in Italy, cut his best cloak into crosses on the spot for anyone who wanted one, and abandoned the siege. His nephew Tancred came with him, a young man of about 20, who would turn out to be one of the ablest soldiers of the age. Robert of Normandy, eldest son of William the Conqueror, was affable, brave, chronically broke, and chronically unserious, and mortgaged the entire Duchy of Normandy to his brother, the King of England, for 10,000 marks of silver in order to go. Robert of Flanders came, and Stephen of Blois, who was married to a daughter of the Conqueror, and who wrote his wife long, affectionate letters from the road which have survived, and which are among the most human documents of the whole business. Hugh of Vermandois came, the brother of the King of France, who was not important, but thought he was. They travelled by 4 separate routes and converged on Constantinople between November of 1096 and May of 1097, and Alexios Komnenos watched them come with a feeling that must have been very close to horror. He had asked for mercenaries. What was arriving at his gates, in successive waves, was an armed host of perhaps 60,000 people, including non-combatants, commanded by men who owed him nothing, one of whom had recently tried to take his empire away from him. Alexios was a supremely careful man, and he did this the way he did everything. He fed them lavishly, which cost less than fighting them. He gave the princes gifts of such magnitude that one chronicler could only describe the treasure being carried in by the armful. He kept the contingents separate, shipping each one across the Bosphorus before the next arrived, so that they were never all on the European shore together. And from each leader in turn, he required an oath. The oath was the thing that poisoned everything afterwards. The princes were to swear to restore to the empire any territory they took that had formerly belonged to it, and to hold any other conquests as his vassals. From the emperor's point of view, this was simple justice. Anatolia and Syria were Roman provinces temporarily in enemy hands. He was hiring soldiers to recover his own property. From the prince's point of view, having sold their lands and mortgaged their castles to come, it looked like being asked to work for nothing. Most of them swore. Godfrey held out through a winter of increasing friction that ended with his men skirmishing outside the walls, and Alexios cutting off their food supply, and then he swore. Raymond of Toulouse refused a full oath of vassalage and gave a modified promise instead, and never trusted the emperor afterwards, and the emperor never trusted him. Bohemond swore with enthusiasm and asked to be made supreme commander of the imperial forces in the east, and was politely refused, and began quietly considering what he might take for himself. Tancred slipped across the strait in disguise to avoid swearing at all. In May of 1097, the combined force sat down in front of Nicaea, the Seljuk capital, a walled city on the shore of a lake, 40 miles from Constantinople. Kilij Arslan, the sultan who had destroyed Peter's people the previous autumn, was away in the east, fighting a rival, and had left his wife, his children, and his treasury in the city. Because he had formed a low opinion of Frankish armies, he came back at speed and threw himself against the southern siege lines, and was beaten off with heavy loss, and then withdrew and left the city to its fate. The siege lasted 5 weeks. The walls had over 100 towers. The lake at the rear kept the defenders supplied, until Alexios had ships dragged overland on rollers and launched onto the water at dawn, drums beating, and the garrison saw that the last door had closed. And then, on the 19th of June, the Crusaders woke to find imperial banners flying from the towers. The garrison had negotiated a surrender to Byzantine officers during the night. Alexios had done it, deliberately and for good reasons. He wanted the city intact, not sacked. He wanted its Christian population alive. He treated the Sultan's family with courtesy and released them for ransom. He paid the Crusader leaders generously in gold and gave the soldiers gifts. It did not matter. The rank and file had spent 5 weeks in the mud under arrow fire on the promise of what lay inside those walls, and they had been cheated of it by a Greek trick. The story went through the camp and hardened there, and it never came out. Every later quarrel with the empire drew on the memory of Nicosia. They marched east into Anatolia on the last day of June, in 2 columns a day apart, which was a serious error. On the 1st of July, the vanguard, under Bohemond and Robert of Normandy, was caught in a valley near a place called Dorylaeum by the whole Seljuk field army. This was the first time Western knights met the Turkish way of war on open ground, and it was very nearly the last thing many of them did. The Turks did not stand. They came on at the gallop, in loose swarms, shot at close range, and swung away before contact, and then came back, and there was no line to break, and nothing to charge. Arrows fell into the camp so thickly that the chronicler who was there wrote that they came like rain. The women of the army carried water to the fighting line all morning under that rain. Bohemond formed a defensive square, with the non-combatants and the baggage inside it, ordered the knights to dismount and hold rather than charge out and be picked apart, and sent riders back down the road for Raymond and Godfrey. They came at midday. Adhemar of Lepuy, the bishop, brought a body of horse around through the hills onto the Turkish flank and rear. The Seljuk army, which had no experience of being attacked by heavy cavalry it could not see coming, broke and did not stop. The camp of the Sultan fell into Crusader hands with all his tents and his gold. It was a total victory, and it taught both sides something. It taught the Turks not to face this enemy in a set battle if they could avoid it. And it taught the Crusaders that they could win, which mattered enormously on what came next. What came next was Anatolia in high summer. Kilij Arslan, unable to fight them, did the sensible thing and burned everything in front of them. The route ran across the central plateau, a country of dry grass and salt lakes, and long, empty horizons, and the wells were poisoned or filled in, and the standing crops were fired. The army crossed it in July and August. Men died walking. Horses died in numbers that changed the nature of the army permanently, so that knights who had come as heavy cavalry ended the march on foot, and some of them loaded their mail onto oxen, and a few rode goats, which the chroniclers found funny in the way that exhausted people find things funny. Dogs were used to carry baggage. Women in labour were left at the roadside because the column could not stop. Godfrey was mauled by a bear while hunting and was carried for weeks. Raymond fell so ill that a bishop administered the last rites. The Bishop of Lepuy was ill. Almost everyone was ill, and it was in this stretch that the expedition first began to come apart along the seams of ambition. Because Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's younger brother, took a small force and left the line of march eastward into Armenian country, where the population was Christian and hated their Turkish overlords. Tancred went the same way to compete with him. They quarrelled over the town of Tarsus, with a bitterness that nearly turned into a battle between them. And Baldwin went on, further east to the ancient city of Edessa, beyond the Euphrates, where the Armenian ruler adopted him as a son and heir in a ceremony that involved being passed inside the old man's shirt, and where, a few weeks later, the old man was torn apart by a mob in circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. Baldwin became Count of Edessa in March of 1098. It was the first of the Crusader states. established before Jerusalem had even been reached. And it was 160 miles from the sea, and would prove impossible to hold. He did not rejoin the main army for a year and a half. The main army, meanwhile, had come down out of the mountains in October of 1097 and stopped in front of Antioch. Antioch was one of the great cities of the ancient world, the place where the followers of Christ were first called Christians, a seat of one of the 5 patriarchs. It sat on the Orontes River with a mountain at its back, and its walls ran for 7 miles up the slope of Mount Silpius and along the ridge and down again, studded with 400 towers, enclosing so much ground that there were orchards and pasture inside them. The citadel stood 1,000 feet above the city. The Emperor Justinian had rebuilt those walls 5 centuries before, and nobody had improved on them since, because nobody had needed to. The Crusader army could not surround it. They did not have the numbers. They sat down in front of the northern gates in October with the harvest of the surrounding country already gathered into the city, and they stayed there for 7.5 months. The winter of 1097 to 1098 in front of Antioch is one of the hardest things in this story to read about. The rains came in December and did not stop. Tents rotted. The ground turned to a swamp of mud and sewage. The foraging parties had to go further and further out and were ambushed by the garrison, who could ride out of the gates. The besiegers did not have men to watch. Prices in the camp rose past anything anyone could pay. They ate the horses, they ate the pack animals, then dogs, then rats, then boiled leather and thistles and the bark of trees. 1 in 7 of the army is thought to have died that winter. Many more deserted. Peter the Hermit himself attempted to slip away and was caught by Tancred and brought back in disgrace. Stephen of Blois, who had written those cheerful letters home, left on the grounds of illness a few days before the end, and rode north and met the emperor coming south with an army to relieve them, and told him the situation was hopeless and everyone below was dead. Alexios, on the strength of that report, turned around and went home. In the West, that decision was never forgiven. It was cited as the moment the emperor abandoned them, and it became the justification for everything Bohemond did afterwards. In Constantinople, it looked like a rational response to accurate information from a senior eyewitness. Both of those things are true, and the gap between them is the whole tragedy of the Latin and Greek relationship. What broke the siege was not force. It was a conversation. Bohemond had been cultivating a contact inside the walls for months, an Armenian convert named Firuz, who commanded a section of the southern defences, including a tower called the Tower of the Two Sisters. Why Firuz turned is unclear. The chroniclers say variously that he was bribed enormously, that the governor had fined him for hoarding grain, and that the governor had taken his wife, perhaps all 3. Bohemond went to the other princes and offered to deliver the city on one condition, that he should keep it. Raymond of Toulouse objected furiously, on the grounds of the oath sworn to Alexios, and one suspects, because he wanted Antioch himself. The argument was still running when news arrived that a very large relief army under Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, was 3 days' march away. The princes agreed to Bohemond's terms that night. On the 2nd of June 1098, a rope ladder came down from the Tower of the Two Sisters in the dark. 60 men went up it. They took the tower, and the towers on either side, and opened a postern gate, and the Crusader army came into Antioch in the last hours before dawn, with trumpets sounding, and the Christian population of the city rising in the streets to help them. The sack that followed was thorough and indiscriminate, and a good many local Christians died in it alongside the Turkish garrison, because In the dark and the noise, nobody was checking. By morning, the city was theirs. Except the citadel on the mountain did not fall, and it held out with a Turkish garrison looking straight down into the streets. And 2 days later, Kerboga arrived with an army that may have numbered 40,000 men, and the besiegers became the besieged. Inside a city they had just stripped bare, with an enemy fortress above their heads and no food at all. The next 3 weeks were the lowest point of the entire expedition. People ate the leather of their shields. The chroniclers, who had strong reasons to present the army well, admit that men were letting themselves down from the walls by ropes at night to desert, and that the soldiers had a name for those who did it. Kerboga, who could have stormed the place, chose to starve it out and spent his time playing chess in his tent and quarrelling with the Syrian emirs in his coalition who did not trust him and had no interest in seeing Mosul grow stronger. And then, on the 10th of June, a poor Provençal pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew came to Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhemar and said that St. Andrew had appeared to him 5 times and had shown him where the lance that pierced the side of Christ lay buried under the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter inside the city. Adhemar of Le Puy, who was an educated man and had seen the actual Holy Lance on display in Constantinople, did not believe a word of it. Raymond of Toulouse believed it entirely, or found it convenient to. On the 14th of June they dug. 12 men worked in the pit all day and found nothing, and in the evening Peter Bartholomew climbed down in his shirt and after a short time came up holding a piece of iron. The effect on the army was electric and immediate. It is very easy, at 900 years' distance, to be knowing about this. It is harder, and more honest to say that thousands of starving men who had been ready to die now believed that God was in the city with them, and that this belief did something to them that food could not have done. On the 28th of June, the Crusaders came out of the northern gate on foot, because there were barely 150 horses left in the entire army, in 5 divisions, with priests in white walking beside the ranks singing, and the Holy Lance carried at the front by Raymond's chaplain. Kerboga let them deploy. He had been told they were finished, and he wanted them all outside the walls, where he could take them at once. By the time he understood that they were forming a line and not fleeing, the Syrian contingents on his left, who had been waiting for a reason, decided that the day was going badly and rode away. The withdrawal became general. It became a rout. The Turkish camp, with all its wealth and its tents and its supplies, was taken intact by men who had eaten boiled shield leather the week before. The citadel surrendered the same afternoon, and then, having achieved the impossible, the crusade sat still for 6 months and nearly ate itself. Bohemond held Antioch and would not give it up. Raymond of Toulouse held the palace and the gate of the bridge and would not give those up either. Adhemar of Le Puy, the one man everyone respected, who had held the leaders together since Clermont, died of an epidemic in August. The princes wrote to Urban asking him to come east and lead them in person, and he did not come. They wasted the autumn, taking small towns in Syria on their own account. It was the ordinary soldiers who ended it. Through the winter the rank and file grew steadily angrier, and in the end the pressure became a threat, articulated openly in the camp, that if the princes did not march on Jerusalem, the army would tear down the walls of Antioch, so that there was nothing left to quarrel over, and go on without them. In January of 1099, Raymond of Toulouse walked out of Antioch barefoot at the head of his men, going south, and one by one the others followed. The road south along the coast of Syria and Lebanon was the easiest part of the entire journey, which nobody quite trusted. The Fatimid governors of the coastal cities, who were Shia, and regarded the Sunni Turks as the greater enemy, mostly preferred to send guides, food and money rather than fight. The emirs of Tripoli and Beirut and Acre paid them to pass by. It was spring, the almond trees were in flower, and the army moved down a green coast, eating well for the first time in 2 years. Only one place gave them serious trouble, the little fortress town of Acre, which Raymond of Toulouse besieged for 3 months out of sheer stubbornness, because he wanted a lordship of his own, and which he never took. It was there that Peter Bartholomew, challenged over the Holy Lance one time too many, offered to prove its authenticity by walking through fire. A corridor of burning olive branches was built. He walked into it carrying the relic and came out the other side, and collapsed. He died 12 days later of his burns, insisting that he had passed through unharmed and been crushed by the crowd. People believed what they had already decided to believe. On the 6th of June 1099, the vanguard under Tancred rode into the hill country of Judea, and on the morning of the 7th, the army came up over the last ridge, at a place they afterwards called Montchoix, and saw it. Men knelt in the road. They took off their shoes. They wept, hardened soldiers of 30 years' service. And the chroniclers who describe it were among them, and make no attempt to be restrained about it. 3 years of marching, and something like 4/5 of their number dead. And there it was, small and gold in the morning light, the walls and the domes and the towers of Jerusalem. Then they went down and looked at it properly, and the difficulty became apparent. The city was walled on every side and stood on high ground with deep valleys below 2 of its faces. The Fatimids had taken it back from the Turks the previous year and had spent that year preparing. The garrison had poisoned or blocked every well and cistern outside the walls, driven off the flocks, and expelled the entire Christian population so that they could not open a gate from within. The nearest timber for siege engines was miles away. It was June in Judea, the temperature climbing past 40 degrees in the middle of the day, and there were perhaps 12,000 fighting men left of the host that had crossed the Bosphorus. A relief army was on its way from Egypt. They tried an assault on the 13th of June on the strength of a hermit on the Mount of Olives, who told them God would give them the city, and it failed badly because they had one scaling ladder. What saved them was the sea. 6 Genoese and English ships came into the harbour at Jaffa, and the crews stripped their own vessels for timber and rope and nails, and came inland with the wood. Parties went up into the woods of Samaria for more, and through the last 2 weeks of June, in that heat, thirsty men built 2 enormous siege towers, a battering ram, and a scatter of ladders and mantlets. On the 8th of July, on the instruction of a vision reported by the priests, the entire army fasted, and then walked barefoot in procession around the walls of Jerusalem, with the clergy carrying relics and crosses, while the garrison on the ramparts jeered and, according to Christian accounts, paraded crosses and spat on them, which did not improve anybody's temper. Then they went back to work. On the night of the 13th of July, Godfrey had his tower dismantled and moved. The defenders had massed everything against the northwestern corner, where it had stood for days. He rebuilt it overnight on the northeastern wall, opposite a stretch that was weakly held. The assault went in at dawn on the 14th, and lasted all that day and into the next. Godfrey's tower came against the wall in the middle of the morning of the 15th of July 1099. 2 Flemish knights, brothers, went across first onto the rampart. Godfrey followed. The St. Stephen Gate was opened from inside, and the army came in. What happened next is the part that everyone remembers, and it deserves to be told carefully, because it has been exaggerated in both directions for 900 years. The Crusaders killed for the better part of 2 days. The Muslim garrison and much of the Muslim population were slaughtered in the streets and in the Aqsa Mosque, where a large number had taken refuge and where Tancred had left his banner as a guarantee of protection, which was ignored by others who came after him. The Jewish community gathered in their principal synagogue, and it was burned with them inside it. There was systematic looting, and men ran through the streets marking houses as their own by hanging a shield or a helmet on the door. The chroniclers of the Crusade, who were writing to celebrate the deed, described blood to the knees of the horses and to the bridle reins. That is an image out of the Book of Revelation, not a report, and no modern historian takes it as measurement. But the Muslim and Jewish sources, and later Christian ones with less to prove, agree on the essentials. A great many people were killed in a city they could not leave. Estimates run from 3,000 to 30,000, and the honest answer is that we do not know. It was not, by the standards of 11th century siege warfare, unprecedented. A city that refused terms and was taken by storm was understood by everyone involved, on all sides, to have forfeited protection. Muslim armies had done the same, and would do it again. What made this one different was not the scale but the meaning, on both sides. To the Crusaders, it was the fulfillment of a promise and the cleansing of a holy place. To the Islamic world, it was an atrocity committed in the third holiest city of the faith by an enemy nobody had previously considered important. And although the initial reaction in Baghdad and Cairo was slower and more confused than it later seemed in hindsight, the memory of it did not fade. On the 17th of July, the killing stopped. On the 22nd, the leaders met to decide who should rule. They offered it first to Raymond of Toulouse, who was the senior man, and who refused either out of genuine piety or because he expected to be pressed and instead found himself taken at his word. Then they offered it to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted and who declined to be called king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He took instead the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, which meant defender, and it is one of the few genuinely gracious gestures in this whole account. 2 weeks later, the Egyptian relief army arrived at Ascalon and was surprised in its camp at dawn and destroyed, and the last threat to the new conquest went away with it. And then, having done the thing they had sworn to do, the overwhelming majority of the survivors went home. They had taken a vow, and the vow was fulfilled at the sepulchre, and they had farms and wives and debts in Europe. Robert of Normandy went. Robert of Flanders went. Raymond of Toulouse went north in a fury to found a lordship of his own at Tripoli. By the autumn of 1099, the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was something like 300 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers holding a city and a strip of coast in the middle of a hostile and enormously more populous world. By any reasonable calculation, they should have been swept into the sea within 5 years. They lasted, in one form or another, for 192. The world the survivors had made for themselves was a long, thin thing, and they called it Outremer, which simply means the land beyond the sea. Look at it on a map, and the strangeness of it becomes obvious. It ran for some 500 miles down the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, from the Armenian mountains in the north to the desert south of the Dead Sea, and in most places it was less than 50 miles wide. In some places it was less than 10. Behind it, inland, lay Aleppo and Hama and Homs and Damascus, Muslim cities of great age and wealth, none of them more than a few days' ride from a Christian castle. In front of it lay the sea, and the sea was the only reason any of it worked, because the sea was where the ships came from. There were 4 states. The county of Edessa, in the far north beyond the Euphrates, landlocked, indefensible, and the first to fall. The Principality of Antioch, wealthy, ancient, with a superb capital, and permanently in dispute with Constantinople. The county of Tripoli in the middle, which Raymond of Toulouse spent his last years besieging, and which his heirs finally took in 1109, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, which was senior in prestige, and generally, though not always, in power. Godfrey of Bouillon died in July of 1100, after a year of rule, probably of typhoid, possibly of something he ate at a dinner given by the Emir of Caesarea. And there are still people who like the second story better. His younger brother Baldwin came down from Edessa with a small escort, forced his way through an ambush in a coastal defile, and was crowned king in Bethlehem at Christmas. He had none of Godfrey's scruples about the title. He was crowned as king, and he ruled for 18 years, and he is the real founder of the kingdom. Baldwin I understood the arithmetic. He had almost no men. What he had was the sea, and a set of coastal cities that were rich, walled, and could not be starved out because they could be supplied by ship. So he made a bargain with the Italian merchant republics, with Genoa, and Pisa, and later Venice, and the terms of that bargain shaped the eastern Mediterranean for 2 centuries. Their fleets would blockade a port while his army sat in front of it. When it fell, they got a third of the city, a street of their own, a church, a bakery, a bathhouse, exemption from tolls, and their own courts. He got a harbour. One by one they came in, Arsuf and Caesarea in 1101, Acre in 1104, which became the great port of the kingdom, and its true capital in everything but ceremony. Beirut and Sidon in 1110. Tyre held out until 1124, and Ascalon in the far south, supplied from Egypt, held out until 1153, and until it fell no crop, in the southern kingdom was ever entirely safe. And behind the coast, on the ridges and at the crossings and the passes, they built. The castles of Outremer are the most visible thing the Crusades left behind, and they are astonishing. Crac des Chevaliers, in the Homs Gap, which stands almost intact today, could hold 2,000 men and a 2-year supply of food, with a spiral ramp wide enough for horsemen. Running up inside the walls, a windmill and a Gothic hall with a carved arcade that would not look out of place in France. Belvoir above the Jordan Valley. Karak in Moab, out in the desert east of the Dead Sea, sitting astride the caravan road from Damascus to Egypt. Saon in the northern hills, where the engineers cut a ditch 100 feet deep through solid rock, and left a single needle of stone standing in the middle of it to carry the drawbridge. These were not built out of confidence. They were built out of a very clear understanding of the numbers. A castle meant that 30 men could hold a valley that would otherwise need 300. It meant that when a great Muslim army came through, and one came through most years, the population could go inside and wait, and the invaders could burn the crops but could not stay, because an army in the field eats itself in a month. And who was going to garrison them? This is where one of the most peculiar institutions of the Middle Ages comes in. Sometime around 1119, a knight from Champagne named Hugh of Paynes and 8 companions came to King Baldwin II with a proposal. They would take monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, and they would live as a religious community. But instead of praying in a cloister, they would they would ride armed on the pilgrim roads and protect the traffic between Jaffa and Jerusalem, which was being picked off constantly by raiders out of Ascalon. The king gave them quarters in the captured Aqsa Mosque, on the Temple Mount, which the Franks believed to be the Temple of Solomon. They took their name from it, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon. The Templars. It was a genuinely new idea, and it made a good many churchmen extremely uneasy, because a monk who kills is a contradiction. It took Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential religious voice in Europe, writing a treatise in praise of this new knighthood to settle the argument. Bernard's formulation was that a knight of Christ who kills in this cause does not commit homicide, but, in his phrase, malicide, the killing of evil. Whether that satisfies anyone now is a separate question. It satisfied the 12th century. The order was confirmed at a council in 1129, and gifts poured in from every corner of Europe, land, mills, rents, whole manors, given by families who wanted a share in the merit and could not go themselves. Within a lifetime, the Templars held property in every kingdom of the West, answered to nobody but the Pope, paid no tithes, and had built by accident one of the first international banking systems in the world, because a pilgrim could deposit money in London and draw it in Acre against a written note. Alongside them, the Hospitallers, who had begun earlier and gently as a hospital order, caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, militarized over the same decades and became the second great fighting order. They kept the hospital, which was a real one, with wards and physicians, and, by the standards of the time, exceptional care. They also came to hold Crac des Chevaliers and a chain of fortresses from the Egyptian frontier to the mountains of Lebanon. Later, in the north, came the Teutonic Knights, German-speaking, who would eventually take their model to the Baltic and conquer Prussia with it. The orders became the standing army of Outremer. They were the only professional soldiers the kingdom had, disciplined, permanently in the field, replaced from Europe as they died. And they could not be ordered home by a bored lord in Picardy. They were also arrogant, jealous of each other, exempt from royal authority, and quite capable of pursuing their own foreign policy in the middle of a war, and every king of Jerusalem found them simultaneously indispensable and infuriating. But what was daily life actually like in this place? Stranger and much more comfortable than the men who came out on later expeditions expected. The Franks who stayed were a small ruling class, perhaps 120,000 people at most, over a population of native Christians of several Eastern churches, Muslims, Jews, Samaritans, Druze and Bedouin, and they discovered very quickly that they could not govern the way they governed in Normandy. Rural Muslim villages kept their own headman and their own law and paid a land tax, and there is a striking passage in a pilgrim's account expressing outrage that the Franks were letting them do it. The settlers adopted the country. They ate its food, they built bathhouses and used them, which shocked visitors from a Europe that had largely lost the habit. They wore loose robes over their mail and put keffiyehs over their helmets against the sun. They married Armenian and Greek and Syrian Christian women in large numbers, and the children of those marriages had a name, the Poulains, and often spoke Arabic before they spoke French. The most quoted witness on all this is a Syrian gentleman named Usama ibn Munkid, who lived to be past 90 and wrote a rambling and wonderful book of memoirs. He fought the Franks for decades, and he also hunted with them, dined in their houses, and had friends among the Templars, who would clear a corner of the Aqsa for him to pray in, and gently steer away newcomers who did not understand which way he was facing. His judgment is worth sitting with. He thought the newly arrived Franks were animals, brave, filthy, ignorant, and jealous of their wives to no purpose. He thought the ones who had lived in the East a long time were civilized and could be dealt with. His medical anecdotes are famous. He describes a Frankish physician who came upon a local doctor successfully treating an abscess with poultices and a knight's fractured leg with dressings, dismissed all of it, asked the knight whether he would rather live with one leg or die with two, and cut the leg off with an axe, killing him on the spot. Trade ran through the ports in enormous volume, and it did not stop for war. Damascus silk, pepper and ginger and cinnamon that had come overland from India, sugar, which Europe had barely known before, and which was refined in the Jordan Valley by Crusader mills, cotton, glass, dyes, and the pilgrim traffic on top of it. The customs house at Acre was said to bring the crown more revenue than the whole kingdom of England brought its king. The politics, meanwhile, were vicious. Because the kingdom was small, everyone was related, and the stakes were absolute. Baldwin I died in 1118 with no heir. His cousin took the throne as Baldwin II, ruled 13 years, and had 4 daughters and no son. So the crown passed through his eldest, Melisende, who was half Armenian and had been raised in the East, and who married a middle-aged French count named Fulk of Anjou, brought over specifically for the purpose. Melisende was crowned jointly with her husband and their infant son, which was her father's deliberate arrangement to keep the kingdom in his own line. Fulk tried to push her aside and rule alone. It went badly for him. The native baronage backed her. There was a scandal involving accusations against a young knight, who was her cousin. That knight was hunted down and killed, and the crisis ended with Fulk, publicly humiliated, and Melisende in effective control of the government. She ruled for another 20 years, through her husband's death in a hunting accident, and through her own son's minority, and then had to be levered out of power by that son in a short and unpleasant civil war. She was a serious politician, a great patron of churches, and one of the more remarkable rulers of the century. And the fact that the kingdom accepted a reigning queen at all tells you how much the ordinary rules had bent in Outremer. For about 40 years the arrangement held, and then in the winter of 1144 the northern hinge broke. Edessa was the weakest of the 4 states and always had been. It was far inland, its Frankish population was tiny, and its count, Jocelyn II, was an unserious man who preferred to live in a comfortable castle west of the Euphrates. In November of 1144, he took the field force out on a raid. Imad al-Din Zengi, the Turkish Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, who had been watching the city for years, arrived in front of it 4 days later. Zengi is the beginning of something new. Until him, the Muslim response to the Franks had been local and uncoordinated. An emir, here striking up a bargain, another there raiding for cattle, and several of them quietly relieved to have a buffer against their rivals. Zengi was the first to put the pieces together, and the first to use the language jihad as a political instrument to do it. Not because he was notably pious, he was by all accounts a brutal and terrifying man, whose own soldiers were frightened of him, but because it worked. Edessa had no professional garrison. Its defence was in the hands of the archbishop and the shoemakers and merchants of the town. They held out for 4 weeks while Zengi's engineers mined under a tower, and on Christmas Eve the tower came down and the city fell. Thousands died in the streets. The Eastern Christian population was largely spared and left in place, and the Latin clergy and Frankish inhabitants were not. The news reached Europe in the autumn of 1145, and Europe was appalled. The First Crusade had become, in 50 years, a story that everyone knew, a thing God had visibly done through the Franks. That it could be reversed was not something anyone had imagined. Pope Eugenius III issued a bull calling for a new expedition, and gave the preaching of it to his old teacher, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot who had endorsed the Templars, and who was probably the most persuasive human being in 12th century Europe. Bernard preached it at Vézelay in Burgundy at Easter of 1146, to a crowd so large that the church could not hold them, and a platform was built on the hillside. Exactly as at Clermont, King Louis VII of France took the cross that day. He was a young man of pronounced piety, who had recently been responsible for the burning of a church full of people at Vitry during a war of his own, and wanted very badly to be forgiven for it. His wife came too, Eleanor of Aquitaine, 24 years old, ruler in her own right of the largest duchy in France, and she brought a substantial force from her own lands. Bernard then crossed into Germany, where he had to spend as much energy suppressing a monk named Radulf, who was preaching massacres of Jews in the Rhineland all over again, and where he cornered the German king Conrad III at Christmas Court in Speyer, and in a sermon delivered directly at him, asked him what he would say to Christ on the day of judgment about the gifts he had been given. Conrad took the cross in tears. For the first time, two crowned kings of the West were going east. It looked overwhelming. It went wrong from the beginning, and it went wrong at every stage. The German army crossed Anatolia first, in October of 1147, took the interior route, ran out of water, was harried for days by Turkish horse archers, and was broken near Dorylaeum, on almost the same ground where the First Crusade had won its victory. Conrad got back to Nicaea with perhaps a tenth of his force. The French, coming behind, took the coastal road, which was longer but safer, and were still badly mauled in the mountains of Pisidia, where the vanguard, under an inexperienced commander, pushed too far ahead and left a gap, and the baggage train and the rear guard were caught on a slope and destroyed. Louis himself fought his way out, with his back against a rock, unrecognised. They reached Antioch in March of 1148, with the fighting strength of the expedition gone and its cohesion with it, and at Antioch the whole thing dissolved into personal disaster, because the Prince of Antioch was Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor of Aquitaine's uncle, who wanted the army to march north and retake Edessa, which was the entire stated purpose of the crusade and made complete strategic sense. Louis refused. He wanted to go to Jerusalem and pray. Eleanor sided with her uncle, loudly and in public, and when Louis insisted, she informed him that she wished to remain in Antioch, and that their marriage was invalid anyway on grounds of consanguinity, which was true. Louis had her seized and taken from the city by night. The marriage limped on for 4 more years and then ended, and Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who 2 years later became King of England and took Aquitaine with her, and took Aquitaine with Acre, and the consequences of that quarrel in Antioch ran through European politics for 300 years. At Acre in June of 1148, the surviving leaders held a council with the barons of Jerusalem and made the single worst decision of the century. They resolved to attack Damascus. Damascus was, at that moment, the one significant Muslim power in Syria that was actively allied with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, precisely because it was terrified of Zengi's son, Nur al-Din, and needed a counterweight. Attacking it was not merely treacherous, it was strategically insane, and the barons of the kingdom, who understood the local situation perfectly, said so. They attacked anyway on the 24th of July, coming in through the orchards on the western side, where there was water and shade. They made progress. Then, for reasons the sources cannot agree on, and which probably involved a promise of Damascus to some prince or other, and a resulting quarrel, the army shifted its camp to the eastern side of the city, where the ground was bare and there was nothing to drink. Relief columns from Aleppo were reported approaching. After 4 days, the whole expedition broke camp and retreated, harassed all the way, having achieved precisely nothing except to convince Damascus that alliance with the Franks was worthless. Within 6 years, Damascus opened its gates to Nur al-Din. The Second Crusade cost enormous sums, killed tens of thousands of people, ruined the reputation of Bernard of Clairvaux, who spent his last years writing defensive treatises about it, and made the strategic position of Outremer materially worse than it had been before. The kings went home in separate ships, barely speaking, and in Aleppo, a young man was consolidating a position that would take him, and then his successor, all the way to the walls of Jerusalem. Nur al-Din, the son of Zengi, was everything his father was not. He was austere, scrupulously just, personally devout, wore plain wool, and had a reputation for piety so solid that it functioned as a weapon. Where Zengi had used the language of holy war cynically, Nur al-Din meant it, and that made him far more dangerous, because it allowed him to present the absorption of one Muslim city after another as a religious duty rather than a conquest. He built madrasas and hospitals. He commissioned a magnificent carved pulpit for the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and kept it in Aleppo waiting for 20 years. By 1154 he held Damascus and Aleppo both, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced, for the first time, a single unified Syria. The strategic key was now Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo had rotted from within, its child caliphs kept in seclusion, its viziers murdering one another in a decade of coups, its enormous wealth defended by an army nobody respected. Whoever took Egypt would have the Nile and its grain and its customs revenue, and would have the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a vice with Syria on one side and Egypt on the other. Both sides saw it. Between 1163 and 1169, King Amalric of Jerusalem invaded Egypt 5 times, and Nur al-Din sent his Kurdish general Shirkuh 3 times, and each intervention was invited by one Egyptian faction against another. Amalric came close. In 1167, he was in alliance with the vizier himself, and had a Frankish garrison in Cairo, but he pushed too hard, sacked a town he had promised to spare, and drove the Egyptians into the arms of Damascus. In January of 1169, Shirkuh entered Cairo, was made vizier, and died 9 weeks later of overeating at a feast, which is not the death anyone plans. His nephew succeeded him. The young man was 31, a Kurd from Tikrit, who had come to Egypt reluctantly and had spent his youth more interested in theology than in soldiering. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, and history knows him by his honorific Salah al-Din, the righteousness of the faith, Saladin. He was appointed because the Egyptian court thought he was young and pliable, and because the emirs of the Syrian army thought the same. And every single one of them was wrong. Within 2 years, he had dismantled the Fatimid regime from inside, dismissed its officials, replaced its Shia judges with Sunni ones, and in September of 1171 had the Friday prayer said in the name of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. The last Fatimid Caliph died a few days later, ill and unaware. 2 centuries of Shia rule in Egypt ended without a battle. And then he did something politically remarkable. He did not hand Egypt over. He acknowledged Nur al-Din as his master, sent tribute, said the right things, and consistently found reasons not to campaign in ways that would have completed his master's encirclement of the Franks, because a Kingdom of Jerusalem that survived was the only thing keeping Nur al-Din out of Cairo. Twice, Nur al-Din made plans to come south and deal with him personally. In May of 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly of a throat infection at the age of 56, leaving an 11-year-old son. 2 months later, Amalric of Jerusalem died of dysentery, leaving a 13-year-old son. Saladin moved. Within 5 months, he was in Damascus, presenting himself as the guardian of Nur al-Din's heir and the protector of the family's legacy. It took him another 12 years of hard, unglamorous, largely intra-Muslim campaigning to make that story true, fighting Zengid relatives, besieging Mosul, surviving 2 assassination attempts by the Nizari Ismailis in his own tent. But by 1186, he ruled Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo and northern Iraq, and the kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded on 3 sides by one man. That kingdom, meanwhile, was in the hands of a boy who was dying. Baldwin IV had been diagnosed with leprosy in childhood. His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, noticed that the boy did not cry when the other children pinched his arm at play, and understood what the loss of sensation meant. He became king at 13 and reigned for 11 years, and the record of what he did in those years is genuinely hard to read without emotion. At 16, with Saladin's army raiding at will in the south, he marched a small force down the coast and caught the Egyptians strung out and unprepared at Montgizard near Ramla in November of 1177, and destroyed them. Saladin escaped on a racing camel with a fraction of his men. The king was carried in a litter for part of that campaign and fought in the battle. He led armies into the field for the next 7 years, while going blind, while losing the use of his hands, while his face was consumed. The barons carried him in a litter to the relief of Kerak in 1183, where a wedding feast was being held inside the castle, while Saladin's siege engines threw stones at the walls, and the besieged sent dishes from the banquet out to Saladin's tent. And Saladin asked which tower the bridal chamber was in, and ordered his engineers not to shoot at it. Both of those things are recorded, and both of them are true, and they tell you something about the strange courtesies that had grown up between these enemies over 80 years. Baldwin died in the spring of 1185, aged 23. His nephew and heir, a child of 7, died the following summer. And with that, the kingdom lost its last agreed succession and fell into the hands of the faction that had been waiting. Guy of Lusignan was a Poitevin newcomer, who had married the king's sister Sibylla and been made regent once and dismissed for incompetence. He was crowned in the summer of 1186 by a manoeuvre that split the baronage, and Raymond of Tripoli, the most capable soldier in the kingdom and the man Baldwin had wanted as regent, refused homage and made his own truce with Saladin. And in the desert east of the Dead Sea sat Raynald of Chatillon, lord of Kerak, who had spent 16 years in a Muslim prison and come out of it with a hatred that had no flaw. In the winter of 1187, during a formal truce, he attacked a great caravan travelling from Cairo to Damascus, took everything, and imprisoned the survivors. Saladin's own sister was said to be travelling with it. When the king ordered restitution, Raynald replied that he was lord in his own land and had no truce. Saladin swore publicly to kill him with his own hand and called up every man he had. The summer of 1187 was very hot and very dry, and that is not a detail. It is the whole battle. Saladin crossed the Jordan at the end of June with something like 30,000 men and laid siege to Tiberias on the lake, where the wife of Raymond of Tripoli was inside the citadel. It was a deliberate provocation, and it worked exactly as intended. The Frankish army mustered at the springs of Sepphoris, in green country with abundant water, and it was the largest force the kingdom had ever put in the field. Perhaps 1,200 knights and 15,000 foot, assembled by stripping every castle garrison in the realm, and by spending the treasure that Henry II of England had sent out as penance for the murder of Thomas Becket. On the night of the 2nd of July they held a council. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was the one under siege, argued that they should stay exactly where they were. Saladin could not hold a large army together indefinitely in the field. Tiberias could be lost and retaken. To march east across 12 waterless miles of bare hill country in July in mail was to hand him the victory. Almost everyone agreed. The council broke up with the decision made to stay, and then, late that night, Gerard de Riedfort, master of the temple, came to King Guy's tent alone and told him that Raymond was a traitor, that the army would think him a coward, and that a king who sat still while a city fell was no king. Guy changed his mind. At dawn the order went out to march. They set off on the 3rd of July into the heat, with the Muslim light cavalry closing on both flanks, and the column moved slower and slower as the day burned on. There was no water. The rear guard under the Templars was engaged so continuously that it fell behind. By afternoon, the army had stopped short of the springs of Hattin, on a bare plateau under 2 low volcanic peaks known as the Horns, and made camp with nothing to drink. Saladin's men lit brush fires upwind through the night, so that the smoke rolled over the Frankish camp. His water carriers went back and forth from the lake in plain view. In the morning the Franks, choking, exhausted, having had no water for a day and a half, tried to break through east toward the water and could not. The infantry went first, breaking away toward the lake in a mass, and being cut off on the slope of a hill, where most of them died or were taken. The knights held on around the True Cross and the royal tent on the higher of the 2 horns, and charged 3 times down the slope at Saladin's own position, and the 3rd charge came close enough that the Sultan's son thought they had won and shouted, and his father told him to be quiet, that they had not won until that tent came down. Then the tent came down. They took the king alive, and the master of the temple, and Reynald of Chatillon, and almost every noble in the kingdom. The relic of the True Cross, which the Franks had carried in every battle for 88 years, was captured and never seen again. In his tent afterwards, Saladin gave Guy a cup of iced rose water, and Guy drank and passed it to Reynald, and Saladin said carefully that it was Guy who had given the drink and not himself, because, by the customs of hospitality, a man who has given you food or water may not then kill you. Then he put the accusation to Reynald directly, and offered him conversion, and Reynald refused with contempt, and Saladin struck him with his own sword, and his guards finished it. Guy, shaking, was told he had nothing to fear. Kings do not kill kings. The 230 Templars and Hospitallers taken that day were another matter. Saladin bought them from their captors and had them executed because he regarded the military orders as an ideological enemy that could not be ransomed, and released to fight again. The chronicler who describes it says the Sufis and scholars in the camp asked for the honour of doing it, and that several made a poor job of it. After Hattin there was nothing left to defend with. Every castle had emptied itself into that army. Acre fell in 4 days. Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, one after another through the summer, most of them surrendering on terms because there was no one inside to resist. Tyre held, and it held only because a nobleman, named Conrad of Montferrat, happened to sail into the harbour by chance days before the city was due to capitulate, and took charge of it, and that accident kept a Frankish foothold in Palestine for the next 100 years. Jerusalem was defended by Balian of Ibelin, who had come to the city under safe conduct to collect his wife and been begged by the population to stay. He had 2 knights. He made 60 more on the spot from the sons of burgesses and organised a defence that held the walls for 12 days while the mines went in on the northern side. Then he went out to negotiate, and when Saladin refused terms, Balian told him plainly that if there were no terms, the defenders would first destroy everything holy in the city, the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa, kill their own families and their 5,000 Muslim prisoners, and then come out and die on the walls. And Saladin would inherit ashes. Saladin consulted his advisors and granted terms. On the 2nd of October 1187, 88 years and a few months after the Crusaders had come over the wall, the city surrendered. The ransom was set at 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child, and those who could not pay would be enslaved. Balian paid for 7,000 of the poor out of the treasury of the hospital. Saladin's brother asked for 1,000 prisoners as a gift and freed them. Saladin freed the old, then the widows and orphans, and by the end had let a great many walk out unpaid, and his own treasurers complained about it in writing. There was no massacre. The Frankish population walked out of the gates in 3 long columns over several weeks, with the patriarch at the head of one of them carrying, according to a disgusted Muslim eyewitness, the plate of the churches and his personal wealth in carts, past his own poor who were being sold. The great gilded cross was pulled down from the Dome of the Rock and dragged through the streets. The Aqsa was washed with rosewater, and the pulpit that Nur al-Din had commissioned 20 years earlier and stored in Aleppo was brought down at last and installed, and the first Friday sermon in Jerusalem in almost a century was preached beneath it. The news reached Rome in late October. Pope Urban III is said to have died of shock on hearing it, which is probably too neat, but he did die that month. His successor issued the call for a new crusade within days. And this time, the kings came. The Third Crusade is the one that entered legend, because it put the 2 most famous personalities of the age directly opposite one another. It is also, if you look at it coldly, a story of very great effort producing a very modest result. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, 67 years old, veteran of a lifetime of Italian wars, was the first to move and brought the largest and best organised army. Perhaps 15,000 men, marching overland through Hungary and Anatolia, with a discipline none of the earlier expeditions had managed. He fought his way past Konya. He was through the mountains, and on the 10th of June 1190, crossing a river called the Salef in southern Anatolia. In the heat of the day, he went into the water and drowned in it. The account says, his heart failed in the cold current. His army disintegrated on the spot, a host of them golden daffodils. Most of them turned around and went home, and a fragment went on under his son, and the greatest professional force ever sent east simply evaporated because of a river crossing. The kings of France and England came by sea, and they came late, because they spent the first 2 years of the Crusade at war with each other and then negotiating. Philip II of France was 25, cold, clever, and interested chiefly in what he could extract from the situation. Richard, the first of England, was 32, 6 feet tall, red gold-haired, an outstanding field commander and siege engineer, personally reckless to a degree that appalled his own staff, fluent in Latin and Occitan, and not much interested in England, which he visited twice in a 10-year reign and taxed comprehensively both times. Richard was late for a reason. On the way east he stopped at Cyprus, where the ruler had mistreated survivors from a wrecked ship of his fleet, and in about 3 weeks he conquered the entire island. It was an improvised act of temper. and it turned out to be the single most valuable thing anyone achieved in the whole expedition, because Cyprus became a Christian kingdom that lasted 300 years and supplied and sheltered the mainland states for as long as they existed. They all converged on Acre, where a siege had been running for 2 years already, started by Guy of Lusignan after Saladin released him. It was a peculiar situation. The Franks were besieging the city, and Saladin's field army was camped in the hills, besieging the besiegers, and both had been there so long that a kind of routine had set in, with truces for markets and soldiers of both sides visiting each other's camps. The arrival of the kings ended it. The engineers went to work, the walls came down in July of 1191, and the garrison surrendered on terms that included a ransom, the return of the True Cross, and the release of prisoners. Philip of France went home almost immediately, pleading illness, having got what he wanted, which was to be away from Richard and near Richard's French lands. And then Richard did the thing that shadows his reputation. When the payment of the ransom stalled past the deadline, with each side accusing the other of bad faith and Saladin, quite possibly playing for time, Richard marched some 2,700 prisoners out onto the plain in front of Acre in view of Saladin's army and had them killed. It was legal by the conventions of the time, and it was, even by those conventions, cold. Saladin executed his own Frankish prisoners in response. What followed was a masterclass in campaigning by both men. Richard moved south down the coast toward Jaffa in the heat of August, with the fleet on his right, keeping his column tight, refusing to be drawn, punishing anyone who broke ranks. At Arsuf, on the 7th of September, Saladin attacked in force, and Richard held the line under arrow fire for hours, waiting for the moment, and when the Hospitallers on the rear guard finally broke and charged. Without orders, he had the sense to commit everything at once and turn an indiscipline into a victory. Twice he marched inland toward Jerusalem, in the winter rain of 1191 and again in the summer of 1192, and twice he stopped a day's ride short and turned back. He was not being timid. He had done the arithmetic. He could probably take the city. He could not hold it, because his army would go home the moment the vow was fulfilled. And there was no field force behind him, and Saladin still held the interior and had already broken down the walls of Ascalon rather than let him have a base. There is a story, and it has the ring of truth about it, that when a scouting party told him the towers were visible from a hill ahead, Richard held his shield up in front of his eyes and would not look, and said that a man who was not worthy to take the city was not worthy to see it. They negotiated for a year while they fought. The two of them never met, but their envoys went back and forth constantly, and Saladin sent Richard fruit and snow from Mount Hermon when he was ill with fever, and Richard sent Saladin's brother a proposal that Saladin's brother should marry Richard's sister, and the two of them should rule Jerusalem jointly as a shared city, which both sides treated with amused seriousness for several months before it collapsed on the question of religion. The Treaty of Jaffa was signed on the 2nd of September 1192. The Franks kept the coast from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, and unarmed Christian pilgrims were guaranteed free access to the Holy Sepulchre, which is very nearly what the whole enterprise had been about a century earlier. Richard sailed on the 9th of October without visiting the city, was shipwrecked in the Adriatic, captured by a duke he had insulted at Acre, sold to the emperor, and held for a ransom that took 2 years and a punitive tax on every man in England to raise. Saladin returned to Damascus and died there the following March, aged 55, of a fever after a reign that had made him master of the Near East. When his officials came to arrange the funeral, they found there was not enough money in his personal treasury to pay for a grave. He had given all of it away. He owned 1 horse and 47 dirhams. What happened next is the strangest episode in the entire 200 years, and the one with the longest consequences. In 1198, a young, energetic, and extremely capable pope named Innocent III came to the throne of St. Peter, and almost his first act was to call another crusade. This time, no kings answered. They were all at war with each other. What answered instead was a body of French and Flemish counts, led, after some early deaths, by Boniface of Montferrat, and their plan was intelligent. Rather than march overland or land in Palestine, they would attack Egypt, which was the real seat of Ayyubid power, and, everyone agreed, the place from which Jerusalem could actually be recovered. To reach Egypt, they needed ships. So in 1201, 6 envoys went to Venice. The Venetians negotiated hard and honestly, and the contract they signed was enormous. Venice would build and crew a fleet to carry 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, provision it for 9 months, and add 50 war galleys of their own in exchange for 85,000 marks of silver and half of all conquests. To do it, the Republic suspended its entire commercial shipping for a year and a half and turned the whole city over to the work. The fleet was ready on time in the summer of 1202. The Crusaders were not. Barely a third of the expected number turned up at Venice, because many had made their own arrangements and sailed from other ports, and the men who arrived could not raise even 2/3 of the money. Here is the trap, and everyone was in it. Venice had spent everything and could not simply forgive the debt. The Crusaders could not pay and could not go home without breaking their vows and their honour. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was 90 years old and nearly blind, and one of the shrewdest men of the age, and he offered a solution: postpone the debt. In the meantime, help Venice recover the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, which had rebelled and put itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Zara was Christian. Its king was a crusader who had taken the cross himself. The Pope forbade the attack explicitly in writing. They took it anyway in November of 1202, and wintered there, and Innocent excommunicated the entire army, then quietly lifted it for the French because he had no other tool. And at Zara, a young man arrived with a proposal. Alexios Angelos was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor, and he wanted the throne, and he offered, in exchange for the army escorting him to Constantinople, 200,000 marks of silver, provisions, 10,000 soldiers for the Egyptian campaign, 500 knights permanently maintained in the Holy Land, and the submission of the entire Orthodox Church to Rome. It was a fantasy. He had no means of delivering any of it. But the army was broke, and he sounded certain, and the leaders persuaded themselves that a grateful emperor on the throne in Constantinople would make the crusade possible instead of impossible. They came into the Bosphorus in June of 1203, and the men who had never seen the city stood at the rails and could not speak. The chronicler, Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who was there, wrote that they had not imagined there could be so rich a place in all the world, and that not a man among them did not shiver. They took the city in July with surprising ease, because the reigning emperor fled in the night, and installed Alexios as co-emperor with his blind father. And then it fell apart in exactly the way it was always going to. Alexios could not pay. He stripped the churches of their plate and melted imperial tombs, and it was not enough. The population, watching a foreign army camped across the Golden Horn being paid out of their icons, turned on him. In January of 1204, a court official strangled him and took the throne himself. The Crusaders were now outside the walls of the greatest city in Christendom, unpaid, unsupplied, with winter closing and their contract with Venice expiring. In March, the leaders and the Venetians signed a treaty dividing the empire between them in advance. They stormed the sea walls from ship, mounted flying bridges on the 12th of April 1204. And this time the defence collapsed, and for 3 days the city was sacked in a way that no city of that size had been sacked in the memory of the world. They burned a district. They broke into Hagia Sophia, tore the silver from the iconostasis, smashed the altar for the stones. In it, drank from the sacred vessels, and set a prostitute on the patriarch's throne to sing. They looted 1,000 years of accumulated relics and shipped them west, which is why the crown of thorns went to Paris. They took the 4 bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since antiquity and set them over the door of St. Mark's in Venice, where Coppi stand today. Libraries burned, classical bronzes that had survived every previous catastrophe were melted for small change. Innocent III, when he understood what had been done in the name of his crusade, wrote that they had turned their swords against their own, that they had spared neither religion nor age nor sex, and that the Greeks were now right to hate the Latins worse than dogs. It changed nothing. A Latin emperor was crowned in Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire fragmented into successor states, one of which recovered the city in 1261 and inherited a ruin of a fifth its former population, permanently poor, permanently vulnerable, and no longer able to serve as the shield of Eastern Europe. 200 years later, the Ottomans took it. The line from 1204 to 1453 is not a straight one, but it is not a broken one either. And the schism between the Latin and Greek churches, which had been a quarrel of theologians in 1054, became after 1204 a wound in the memory of an entire people that has still not healed. The Crusades went on for another century, but the shape had changed. They had become an instrument. Innocent III himself called a crusade against Christian heretics in the south of France, the Cathars of Languedoc, with the same indulgence attached. And that war ran for 20 years and destroyed the civilization of Occitan poetry and delivered the south to the French crown. Crusades were preached against pagan Prussians and Lithuanians, against the political enemies of the papacy in Italy, against rebels in Aragon, and there was the episode remembered as the Children's Crusade of 1212, which was probably not children and probably not a crusade, but 2 separate movements of poor young people in France, and the Rhineland who believed the sea would open for them because they were innocent. It did not. The German group struggled over the Alps and dispersed in Italy. The French group is said to have been offered free passage by ship owners at Marseille and sold in North Africa, and whether that is true or a later moral tale, none of them came back. The Fifth Crusade, from 1217 to 1221, finally did the thing everyone had known for decades, was correct, and attacked Egypt directly. It took Damietta at the mouth of the Nile after 18 months. The Sultan then offered, in exchange for its return, Jerusalem itself and most of Palestine. The papal legate, a Spanish cardinal named Pelagius, who had taken command of the army, refused twice on the grounds that God would give them everything. He then marched on Cairo in the summer, with the Nile rising, was cut off by the flood and the opening of the sluices, and had to surrender the whole army and Damietta, with it to be allowed to walk out. The Sixth Crusade is the one that succeeded, and it succeeded by talking, which is why nobody was satisfied with it. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, raised in Palermo among Arabic speakers, fluent in the language, skeptical in religion, and excommunicate for repeatedly postponing his vow, finally sailed in 1228 and negotiated with the Sultan al-Kamil, who happened to be facing a family crisis in Syria, and wanted the problem to go away. In February of 1229, they signed a treaty giving Jerusalem back to the Christians, along with Bethlehem and Nazareth and a corridor to the coast, on conditions that the Temple Mount remained in Muslim hands and the city was not refortified. Jerusalem was Christian again for 15 years, obtained without a battle by an excommunicate emperor, and it satisfied nobody. The Patriarch placed the city under interdict. Frederick crowned himself in the sepulchre because no clergyman would do it. When he left Acre, the butchers of the city pelted him with offal in the street. Muslim opinion was equally disgusted with al-Kamil. The city was lost for good in 1244 to a horde of Khwarezmian horsemen driven west by the Mongols, who took it, burned the sepulchre and dug up the tombs of the kings and moved on. Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis, made two enormous and expensive attempts. In 1249 he took Damietta again, marched on Cairo again, was defeated at Mansoura. When his brother charged too soon, was trapped by disease in the river and captured with his entire army, and was ransomed at colossal expense. He then spent 4 years in Palestine rebuilding fortifications with his own money because nobody else would. In 1270 he sailed again, landed at Tunis on a doubtful strategic theory, and died of dysentery on the beach. By then a new power had risen in Egypt, and it was the end of everything. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, mostly Turkic and Circassian, bought as boys, raised in barracks, converted, trained to a standard no other army in the region approached. And in 1250 they overthrew the last Ayyubid Sultan and took Egypt for themselves. 10 years later, at Ain Jalut in Galilee, they did what no one else had managed and defeated a Mongol army in open battle, and that victory made them the greatest power in the Islamic world. Their Sultan Baybars, who had commanded at Ain Jalut and then murdered his way to the throne, understood the Frankish coast perfectly. It was a chain of ports and castles held by too few men, dependent on reinforcement that came irregularly from a Europe that had stopped caring. He did not need a great battle. He needed patience. He took Caesarea and Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, where the Templar garrison surrendered on terms, and was executed on a hillside, Antioch in 1268. After 170 years of Frankish rule, and the sack of Antioch was so complete that the city never recovered, and Baybars wrote a letter to its absent prince, describing in careful detail what had been done to his people and his churches, so that he would know what he had lost. Crac des Chevaliers itself fell in 1271, that impossible fortress taken in a month by mining and, quite possibly, by a forged letter ordering surrender. The truces held for a while under his successors. Then, in 1291, over an incident in Acre, in which newly arrived Italian crusaders murdered Muslim merchants in the market, and the city refused to hand them over, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil came north with an army that contemporaries put in the hundreds of thousands and certainly numbered many tens of thousands, and 90 siege engines, and sat down in front of the last great city of Outremer. The siege of Acre lasted 6 weeks. The city had double walls and 12 towers and perhaps 15,000 people able to fight. The engines worked day and night. The miners went under the accursed tower at the salient of the northern wall, and on the 18th of May, the assault came in through the breach at dawn. The master of the temple, William of Beaujeu, was mortally wounded, holding the gap and carried away by his men. And when someone accused him of fleeing, he opened his cloak and showed the wound in his side. The Hospitaller Master was carried out unconscious. The population ran for the harbour, where there were not nearly enough ships, and a storm was blowing, and a Catalan captain named Roger de Flor made a fortune that day charging noble women everything they owned for a place aboard. The Templar castle on the seawall held out for 10 more days with civilians inside. Terms were agreed. A detachment of Mamluks came in to take possession and began molesting the women and boys, and the Templars closed the gates and killed them all and threw the surrender banner off the tower. Then the mining resumed, and on the 28th of May, the seaward wall gave way under the weight of the attacking column, and brought the whole structure down, killing everyone inside it, and a great many of the attackers with them. The remaining towns did not resist. Tyre was abandoned without a fight. Sidon, Beirut, Haifa, Tortosa, Athlit, all evacuated within the summer. The Templars held the small island of Ruad off the Syrian coast for another 12 years, and then lost that too. And that was the end of the Latin East. 200 years after Urban stood on a wooden platform. In a cold field at Clermont, the last of them sailed out of a burning harbour in a storm. What are we to make of all of it? Nothing tidy. The Crusades did not achieve their stated aim, which was the permanent recovery of Jerusalem. And they did not stop the advance of Islam, which resumed under the Ottomans 2 centuries later, and reached Vienna. They cost, by any estimate, hundreds of thousands of lives and enormous quantities of treasure. They inflicted a permanent scar on the Jewish communities of Europe and a permanent breach between the Latin and Greek churches. And they were used, again and again, as a template for turning holy war on whoever was convenient. They also did other things, less intentionally. The Italian maritime republics grew rich on the traffic and became powers in their own right, and the money that flowed through Venice and Genoa in those centuries had something to do with what came afterwards in Florence and Rome: sugar and cotton and glassmaking and windmills and paper. And the numerals we still use travelled west along those routes, though most of them came through Sicily and Spain as much as through Palestine. Europeans learned to build fortifications properly by studying the ones they were trying to take, and an enormous literature came out of it in the West: the chansons and the chronicles and the romances, which shaped how Europe thought about knighthood for 500 years. In the Islamic world, the memory worked differently. For a long time, it did not loom especially large. The Franks had been one enemy among several, and considerably less frightening than the Mongols. It was largely in the 19th and 20th centuries, under European empire, that the Crusades were reconstructed as the first chapter of a longer story. And Saladin, who had been a fairly ordinary figure in Arabic historical memory, became a hero to be invoked. The word itself has kept a strange half-life. It gets used, still, by people who mean a good cause pursued with total commitment, and by people who mean something much worse, and the fact that the same word does both jobs tells you how unfinished the reckoning is. But, underneath all of that, the thing that stays with me is smaller and harder to place. It is the ordinary people on the road. The ones who sold 7 vineyards for a horse. The ones who asked at every walled town whether that was Jerusalem. The woman carrying water to the line at Dorylaeum under the arrows. The shoemakers on the walls of Edessa. The knight in the desert who could not feel his own hands and had himself carried into battle in a litter at the age of 22. The Syrian gentleman who prayed in a corner of the Aqsa while a Templar shooed the newcomers away. They believed they were living inside a story that God was telling, and that it was going somewhere. They walked a very long way to find out. Most of them never came back, and the ones who did came back to a village that had gone on without them, and told the story on winter nights until they died, and then somebody else told it. And the road east is still there, under the tarmac, going where it always went. Here our story settles into stillness. The towers come down slowly, one by one along a coast, and the sea takes back the harbours, and the grass grows through the courtyards of castles that will stand empty in the sun for 800 years with nobody left to hold them. The names grow quiet now. The kings and the sultans, the preachers and the pilgrims, the barefoot man on his donkey and the boy king in his litter, all of them lie down at last in the same dust, under the same wide and patient sky. There is nothing left to defend tonight, nothing to march toward, no wall to climb, no road to walk before morning. Let it all drift away from you gently, the way a fleet drifts out of a harbour and grows small, and then is only water. Rest now. Let your breathing slow. Let the light go. Sleep well and good night.